Hello. This video, being released today, January 14th, 2022, is an update to our Muhlenberg County School District's isolation and quarantine release procedures. Before we get into the changes, I want to take a moment to review the differences between quarantine and isolation. These are two very important terms that can be confused quite easily, so let's take a minute to review. On the second half of your screen, the right half, you'll see the word isolation. Isolation keeps someone who is sick or who has tested positive for COVID-19 without symptoms away from others, even in their own home. Isolation is a term used to refer to a person who has tested positive. Quarantine keeps someone who has been in close contact with the person who's tested COVID-19 away from others. A close contact is a person who's been exposed to COVID under the following conditions. They were unmasked, within 6 feet, for more than 15 minutes, within the past 48 hours of when that person's symptoms first began. So quarantine is the term referred to people who have been exposed to someone who's positive for COVID. Isolation is a term used for people who have tested positive. That becomes very important whenever we're talking about the differences between the two and then how long the person should remain out of school. A reminder for everyone is that all students, teachers, and staff who think they may have COVID should stay away from school even if they have been vaccinated for COVID-19. Symptoms of COVID include fevers, chills, new cough, shortness of breath, headache, sore throat, vomiting, diarrhea, and loss of taste or smell. And we encourage everyone who thinks they may be sick to get tested and stay away from school until they receive their results so that they'll prevent from unknowingly exposing other people to this virus. Let's begin with our changes in isolation release procedures. The Muhlenberg County Health Department is the authoritative source for all COVID cases. Muhlenberg County Schools works in conjunction with the local health department to determine the release dates for people who have tested positive for COVID and who are associated with our schools. So if you've tested positive for COVID, you should self-isolate for at least 5 days, regardless of your vaccination status. You need to contact the school to let us know that you have tested positive, and you need to begin counting on that day forward up to 5. If your symptoms have fully resolved and you can continue wearing a well-fitting mask for 10 full days, then isolation can end after the 5th day. However, if you're unable to wear your mask consistently or properly, or if your symptoms continue, then you must isolate for the 10 full days to be released on the 11th day. I want to take a moment to talk about two very positive things that help reduce our overall quarantines in our school community. Number one, we continue to require universal masking for all students and staff. And because we have universal masking in place, the chances of your child being quarantined are greatly reduced. And number two, the vaccination status. The following people do not need to quarantine following an exposure as long as they're not experiencing symptoms. Students between the ages of 5 and 17 who've completed their primary COVID-19 vaccine series at least 2 weeks prior to the exposure. People who are 18 or older who are up to date with their recommended vaccinations, including their booster, and then people who have had a documented COVID-19 illness in the previous 3 months. And that documented case must be verified through the health department. That would not come from a home test. So this is the sheet that will explain the different types of COVID-19 exposures and how that relates to quarantine. This sheet does not include everything, but it includes most of the information. And as you can see, it can be quite complicated. So I'll say here and I'll say again in a moment that clear, consistent, open, and honest communication between our school community and our families will be very important to make sure that we keep everyone as safe and healthy as possible. So if you have a question or you're concerned or you are impacted by COVID, we definitely want to be having conversations with you so that we can help you make the best decisions and we can make the best decisions here at school. So on this sheet, you'll see that we have 3 types of exposures. We have exposures at school. The middle section describes exposures at home. And the third column describes an exposure that would happen outside of the home, like at church, a family gathering, or a birthday party. So let's begin with our exposures at school. So if you have been notified that you have been exposed to COVID, the child or the staff member was unmasked, and they're unvaccinated, they will need to enter into quarantine. During this period of time, they will be expected to wear their mask consistently and properly. The question in the middle of the page says, how long will my child's quarantine last? If the child cannot wear the mask consistently and properly, the child will quarantine for a full 10 days. However, quarantine may end after day 5 if the child remains symptom-free, receives a negative COVID test on day 5 or after, is able to wear the mask at all times, indoors for the next 10 days, or the child can enter into test to stay. Under test to stay, quarantine can be avoided if the child is symptom-free, enrolls in the program, and then tests for 5 consecutive days and receives a negative test each day. And additionally, will wear that mask while indoors. If either of those 2 options are not appropriate, then the child will quarantine for a full 10 days to come back to school on that 11th day as long as the child is symptom-free. This third option would not require any testing. The middle column describes the exposures in the home. So if the child is not fully vaccinated and has been exposed to someone in the home, this means they have an ongoing contact. In an ongoing contact situation, the child is going to remain home quarantining while the positive person in the home is there isolating. If the parent wants the child to participate in test to stay, the quarantine may be discontinued on the release date of the positive person in the home, as long as the child receives a negative COVID-19 test, has no symptoms, is enrolled in the test to stay program, and tests for an additional 5 days, 5 school days, and continues to wear that mask at all times. This will greatly reduce the overall number of days the child is in quarantine, because as soon as the positive person in the home is released, then the child would return to school and test every single day for the next 5 days with negative tests. If the parent does not want the child to participate in test to stay, then the child will begin that second part of quarantine at home immediately following the isolation period and will continue there for at least 7 days. The child will be able to test on days 5, 6, or 7 to return on day 8 if there's negative test results. The third option there would be if the parent doesn't want to have the child tested at all, then the child would stay out an additional 10 days instead of the 7 days, and they wouldn't have to take a test, return on that 11th day without symptoms. And then thirdly, we have exposures in the home on the right side of the page. Again, this would be for a contact that was made at maybe a church or a family gathering, a birthday party. It would be very important to immediately stop all exposure to the positive person and then enter into quarantine. The quarantine can be discontinued after 5 days if the person is symptom-free, obtains a negative COVID test on day 5 or after, and is able to wear their mask. But quarantine may be avoided altogether if the parent wants to enroll the child in test to stay, is able to be symptom-free, test for 5 consecutive school days, and wears the mask. So again, I know that this sounds very confusing, and it can be. So we want to have open conversation with the families to make sure we're making the right decisions. We've had a lot of questions about home tests, so before we end, I want to cover that home tests that are not collected or monitored by trained healthcare provider is not conducted in a certified lab. Those are not reportable to public health. So any individual who tests positive for COVID-19 through an at-home test, we recommend that that person begins isolating and also to schedule a COVID-19 test at a testing location. This will ensure that their positive test result is accurately recorded with the health department. You can visit our Muhlenberg County Health Department's Facebook page for a complete list of testing locations, and all school staff and students, they're eligible for free COVID testing through Ethos laboratories. And so on this screen, you will see a link that you can go to sign the child up for free COVID testing. This concludes our updates to our isolation and quarantine release procedures. I know there may be many questions, so just we try to understand these the best that we can together, and then let's continue to look forward to a better day.